Welcome. In this video, we are continuing our discussion of political philosophy in the course PHI 331, and we're still looking at the question of what justifies the existence of the state. Whereas last week we looked at a libertarian view from Michael Huemer, we're going to be looking at another contemporary philosopher today, Elizabeth Anderson, who develops an anti-libertarian view. She thinks that there are plenty good reasons to give certain powers to the state. And we're going to find that argument in Lecture 2 from a book she put out a few years ago called Private Government. Now, Private Government is based on a series of lectures. Lecture 1 is really interesting, but we're just going to be looking at Lecture 2 for this course. And it's about government, but also the nature of work and employment, and how that reveals something to us about what justifies the existence of the state. So, here's the first thing that we'll do. We'll consider a state that might not be justified in its existence, in the way that it governs, and that is a certain kind of dictatorship. So we're going to think about a dictatorship first, and then we're going to see how that applies to work, which will eventually get us to a defense of certain state regulations, and it's going to also offer Anderson some opportunities to reflect on how to make workers more free. So, without further ado, let's consider the idea of a communist dictatorship. So here's the dictatorship Elizabeth Anderson has us consider. She says, imagine you're in a situation where, as she puts it, superiors are unaccountable to those they order around. They are neither elected nor removable by their inferiors, and the inferiors in this government have no right to complain in court about how they are being treated, except in a few narrowly defined cases. In this government, they do not recognize a personal or private sphere of autonomy free from sanction. They prescribe a dress code, forbidden certain hairstyles, and they may forbid you from talking about certain things. People can be sanctioned for their consensual sexual activity, or for their choice of spouse or life partner. They can be sanctioned for their political activity, and they can be required to engage in political activity they don't agree with. And within this government, the economic system is communist. The government owns all the non-labor means of production, and it organizes production through central planning. So the form of government is a dictatorship because of these unaccountable demands from the superiors. We have a dictator appointed by an oligarchy, and in other cases, in some of other similar dictatorships, we have a self-appointed dictator. And Anderson notes, in this particular dictatorship, this government exercises control over members in a pervasive way, although it has limited sanctioning powers. It doesn't execute or imprison people. It can demote people to lower ranks within the government. But the most common sanction is exile, to send somebody off to find a different government to live under, or perhaps maybe set up their own dictatorships. Now, you may see where this idea is going. Anderson says, this does seem like a pretty unjustifiable dictatorship. This is also basically the character of the contemporary American workplace. She points out that in the contemporary American workplace, we have arbitrary demands being issued by superiors. There is extreme surveillance. For instance, many employers can and will read an employee's emails or keep them under tight surveillance while they're working. And this is even the case in work-from-home situations where an employee might have their screen captured randomly throughout their workday. Of course, exile is basically equivalent to firing, right? And Anderson notes that the tricky thing about the American workplace is that if you choose to leave your job that you don't like, let's say you don't like working as a picker at an Amazon warehouse, she points out that oftentimes the things that you don't like about that job will be present in the next job that you might sign up for. So if you leave the Amazon warehouse, you might end up working, at the meatpacking plant on the other side of the highway. Now, many workplaces do place limits on employees' private lives. And this goes all the way back to the history of, say, the Ford Motor Company, where Anderson notes that employees were given a $5 a day wage, true, but they were also checked up on, and they were expected to not drink alcohol, not have boarders in their house, keep certain standards of hygiene, even beyond their work lives. And for a long time, there were situations where employees would be fired for their sexual orientation. Now, since Anderson published this book in 2019, the Supreme Court has made rulings that prevent employers from firing on the basis of sexual orientation. But the fact that we have made an improvement in that way is actually further defense for Anderson's argument. We shouldn't, she seems to think, be able to tolerate an employer firing somebody for their sexual orientation. And there are still cases where employers can require employees to, say, attend political rallies. In many cases, employees can be punished for their use of recreational drugs on their off time. So in this way, Anderson says that there is this sort of pervasive control over our lives that employers exert. She even notes that in this way, a private workplace can require some things like political behavior or even sexual orientation discrimination prior to that Supreme Court ruling. Private workplaces have and can sometimes require things of you that would be unconstitutional for the government itself to require you to do. And how are these dictatorships communist? Well, communism, in terms of a government structure, is characterized by ownership of all non-labor means of production and centralized planning. And if you look at how a big American corporation, even a corporation like Tesla, is run, of course, there is a centralized planner for how and when certain cars are going to be made within that factory. And of course, the tools are owned by the company itself, and they also own all of the raw materials that go into the making of their cars. So in this way, Anderson says there are big ways in which employers limit our freedoms, and that if we saw the state or the government doing these kinds of things rather than private corporations, we would find these things horrifying and dictatorial. So Anderson's question here is basically, if it's not okay for the government to do it, why is it okay for a private corporation to do these kinds of things? Now, Anderson does consider the possible defense. Why are we not as bothered by this when it's done by corporations rather than the state? And here are a couple of lines of thought. One thought that Anderson brings out is the idea that workplace authority relationships are justifiable because they're based on voluntary contracts. We actually kind of see this line of thought in our reading from Humer last week, where he says, it would be wrong for a person to just cut you with a scalpel, but if you consent to a surgeon performing surgery on you, it can be okay, right? So this idea that consent can take something unjustifiable, like coercion, in one context can make it okay through consent. We might note, after all, that the employment contract is something that a worker is free to leave. You do have the option of quitting your job if you don't like it. So that's one thought that Anderson will consider. Here's another line of thought, that we should allow employers to do this because otherwise we would need to create state regulations. And every time the state creates a regulation, the individual becomes less free. Anderson quotes a public figure on this line of thought, a guy named Ken Cuccinelli. He was the Attorney General, I believe, of Virginia at the time of the book's publication, although Cuccinelli did end up serving in the first Trump administration. I believe he was the acting director of Customs and Immigration Services. But in any case, in one of his books, here's something that Cuccinelli tells us. He says, well, we should, favor freedom, right? And if we don't favor freedom, what we're doing is we're going to increase government power. So he says something like this. Cuccinelli says, every single thing government does to increase its own power increases the size of its slice, the government's slice of the so-called liberty pie, right? And since there are only two slices, right, depending on where we put the blade in this pie that we're slicing, every time the government's slice of liberty grows, the citizen's slice is reduced. So in this way, we might think of liberty as a finite resource like pie. And in this way, every time the state creates a regulation, individuals become less free. And the thought would be leaving corporations to figure out how to run their own businesses, to make at-will decisions about who to hire and fire when they choose to. That comes with certain costs, but the reverse cost would be to create regulations and make us less free. Now, an important line of thought that Anderson is going to pursue is she's going to say, this is the wrong way to think about freedom. And she's going to say that certain state regulations will make us, on the whole, more free than if there were no state regulations at all, and it's not a zero-sum situation. So, how is she going to build up to this point? Well, in order to build up to this point, Anderson is going to offer a conceptual clarification first, that at first might seem almost contradictory or paradoxical. And this is where Anderson tells us that we should think of a corporation like Amazon or Tesla as what she calls a private government. So how is she going to defend this line of thought? Well, she's going to say, first, she's going to acknowledge that if you identify government with the state and the state as being the public sphere, then the notion of private, which is the opposite of public, could not be possible, right? It would be oxymoronic to talk about private government just to, say that, like, look, you can't talk about an adult child because those are, like, opposite concepts. Privacy is supposed to be thought of as opposite from government, which is about the state, the government, and the public sphere. Anderson wants to challenge this line of thought because she has a line of thought that says that really there's more to government than just the state. And she's going to say, actually, we find government in all sorts of places. So wherever some have the authority to issue orders to others backed by sanctions, and that might be in one or more domains of life. So for instance, you could think of a college class as a little government that is led by the teacher. The Constitution might be a certain kind of syllabus, and we might realize that the instructor of a course has the authority to issue certain orders, like requirements for when certain assignments come in with certain standards for them, and they can back these requirements with sanctions. Of course, the sanctions of a college course could be, most of the time, certain grades, a passing grade or a failing grade, or an A instead of a C. And maybe in some cases, with certain kinds of behavior, the sanction could also involve something like expulsion from the class, if you're behaving against the student code of conduct, right? So the college classroom is another domain of life that we might call government. We might also talk about relationships between parents and children, right? You have authority as a parent to issue certain orders or requirements and to give certain sanctions or rewards. Anderson could go on, but her main point that she wants to drive home here is that a workplace is a kind of government, because an employer has the authority to issue certain orders to tell you what to do with your workday and to create standards for what good work counts as. And there are sanctions. There's the possible threat of unemployment, and we might also say that there's also positive incentives along with sanctions, like promotion or bonuses, these kinds of things. So here's the first line of thought. There is a sense in which a workplace is a government. And she's also going to say it's not quite right to say that public versus private is just another way of talking about governmental versus non-governmental. And here's how she puts it. She says, well, if something is legitimately kept private from you, that means that it's legitimately none of your business, right? So there are certain things about my personal life where I don't have to talk about them if I don't want to. You can't make me, right? Now, we might say that that is private information about myself. And if it's none of your business, then we might say it's not public information to you. But we might also realize that some information about me is relatively public. So for instance, North Carolina state employees do have their salaries published on the internet. In that case, like, my salary is public information, right? You might also realize that if you are a student at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, you have the entitlement to see what classes I'm teaching throughout the semester. You can go look in the course catalog. And in that sense, that information about me is public to you. So the idea is something can be your business, and in that sense, it will be public. And we might say that not only can information be public or private, but she says if something is public, that means that it is the business of a group of people, that public, that is, such that no one is entitled to exclude any member from the group making it their business. And that might involve things like decision-making, entitlement to information, ability to have your interests have standing in decision-making, and the ability to hold decision-makers accountable. So in this way, there is governance, say, in a university classroom, but there is a certain amount of publicity where students will have a say and be able to hold their teachers accountable through things like discussions with higher-ups, whether that be my department chair or deans, right? And there are also things like instructor evaluations, right, where there's that certain ability to hold decision makers accountable. And in that way, there's a little bit of publicity in the way that, say, the governance of college students by their instructors is public, right? This public nature of how you are educated is sort of reflected in the fact that your interests have standings as a student. You can have some decision-making power, and you do have some power to hold decision makers accountable, right? So we can think about this as whether something is your business. Another way to think about it is whether you have a say. And Anderson will note that whether something is private is relative to who you are. So certain information about which classes that I teach when in any number of semesters, that will be public information to a UNC Greensboro student, but it won't be public information to just anybody, right? So Anderson says that there is a certain amount of relativity to whether a particular sort of governance is public or private. But you will also say that, in American history, one way that we can think about progress in American history is the way in which we have made our government institutions more public, right? Because, in the founding of America, we could think of, who has a say in whose business the way the government is was restricted to white men. But to the extent that the women's suffrage movement and emancipation and eventually the civil rights movement gave people of color, gave women more standing in stating their interests, more ability to hold decision makers accountable, we could think of the government, the state in this case, becoming more public in the sense that more people have a say and an ability to hold those in power accountable. So we can think about government being made more public. Anderson, now that we have the concepts of government issuing orders with the threat of sanction and publicity as a matter of whether or not it's made your business, the process of decision making, Anderson will say, you are the subject of private government, wherever you are subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you for not complying over some domain of your life, and the authorities treat it as none of your business across a wide range of cases what orders it issues or why it sanctions you. And Anderson's line of thought is the way that at-will employment is structured in America is a kind of government because there are authorities who will order you and sanction you. But moreover, if you don't have a say in who your superiors are or the nature of your orders, well, in that case, the orders are treated as, decisionally speaking, not your business. And in that way, we can think of the workplace as this initially paradoxical concept. The workplace could be seen as a private government, according to Anderson. Now that we have the idea that government can be private and that the workplace can be considered a private government, Anderson's going to say that, in fact, the Cuccinelli approach, this zero-sum approach to freedom, is going to be mistaken. So we don't necessarily have more freedom when a private government is given the ability to act solely as it chooses. And this is mainly related to the fact that freedom is a more complex term than Cuccinelli realizes in his zero-sum approach. So Cuccinelli does seem to recognize this idea of negative freedom. So when we're talking about negative freedom, we're talking about the right to be left alone, right? You are negatively free when no one is interfering with your actions. And in fact, when we read someone like Hobbes, that is a large part of what Hobbes is arguing. He's saying that we will give up some of our negative freedom in order to secure our lives, right? So security over negative freedom, because once we live under the Leviathan, as we learned from Hobbes, there is somebody who will interfere with your actions, but that's a worthwhile trade-off, Hobbes thinks, because of the safety that it brings. Now, if this were the only concept of freedom, Cuccinelli's argument would kind of work. You could have more or less freedom. There are pros and cons to having more or less freedom, but every time you give freedom to somebody else, that is, like, you give freedom to the Leviathan, to the sovereign, to coerce your actions, that takes away negative freedom for you. That's a certain kind of interference. But Anderson says we can also think about freedom in terms of what we might think of as having a rich menu of options effectively accessible to you given your resources. So, think about the fact that on a desert island, there is nobody interfering with your actions. You are not told, do this or that or the other thing, or else, right? In that way, on a desert island when you're all alone, you have maximum negative freedom. But you don't have much positive freedom, right? You don't have the freedom to get an education, right? You don't have the freedom to go eat a 5-course meal, or you don't have the freedom to go to the library. After all, you're on a deserted island. As Anderson puts it when she looks at that example, like all you really can do on a deserted island is sit around and eat coconuts. So you don't have a rich menu of options given your situation and your resources. So we can already see here that maybe we might think of negative freedom as valuable in many ways and some of the times, but we might give up some of our negative freedom for positive freedom. So we might have more positive freedom, for instance, if we paid some taxes, but then that also created things like libraries that give us media to consume, or roads that give us places to go. So in that way, we might make a sacrifice of negative freedom, have less negative freedom by paying taxes, but we would have more positive freedom by increasing our set of options. Anderson says that there's also a third kind of freedom. It almost feels like negative freedom at first, but it's subtly different. And we can call this kind of freedom Republican freedom. It's not necessarily associated with the Republican political party, although many people in the Republican Party would be impressed with this sort of freedom. And the idea is that it's also a valuable thing to not be subject to somebody else's arbitrary, unaccountable will. One way of thinking about a Republican approach to government as opposed to a monarchist approach to government is you are not being ruled over by a king. Right? So one of the benefits of living in a democracy, many will believe, is that those who rule you are accountable to you. And that if somebody in power acts badly, you are given the option to hold them accountable, change your leader, and so forth. And Anderson says, in a sense, again, on the desert island, you also have a lot of Republican freedom, right? There is nobody else bossing you around, but that all on its own isn't always a good thing if you don't have options for how you might carry out your life. So the way that Anderson thinks about it is that we might notice some situations where, like if you're living on a desert island, you've got high negative freedom and high Republican freedom and low positive freedom. She also points out that if you're living as the subject of a king, you might have high negative freedom. Maybe if the king likes you, he'll leave you alone. And you might also have a lot of options given to you, being a king's favored subject. But you might have low Republican freedom, right? Because you might be fearful enough that at any moment the king's arbitrary will might turn on you. Now, in this way, Anderson will even say that maximum negative freedom is not necessarily a good thing. Because, as she puts it, you might think of this as anarchist communism. This goes back to Hobbes. If we had maximum negative freedom, there would be no property rights. In fact, because there are no laws, everybody can do whatever they please. Nobody can stop you. And in this way, we would have continual chaos. We wouldn't have industry because everyone is competing for commonly unowned goods. This is quite close to pretty much the argument that Hobbes gives us. If everything were legal, we would have maximum freedom, but that would not necessarily make for a good life. And Anderson will point out that when we establish a property right, so I have this water tumbler here, and this water tumbler is my property. Right? And in the sense that it's now my property, you have fewer negative freedoms, right? Because, for instance, basically all 7.9 or 8 billion people on this planet are now no longer allowed to take this cup and do as they wish with it. Only I get to, right? But because everybody else has to stay away from my goods and property, that means I have more control over my stuff, and it means that I have more options to plan and carry out my life as I see fit. I don't have to scramble and figure out what to contain my water in every time I plan to have a drink. So in this way, by putting sanctions on people for doing certain things, which is taking their right to not be interfered with, that can increase the liberty of others. And we might think that we're all better off when we all have the right to have exclusive control over some goods. So as Anderson puts it, the state's imposition of negative liberty constraints on some people can thereby enhance all three liberties of many more. So in this way, we don't have to think about liberty as a finite resource, but instead, by placing the right regulations in the right places, we might have more liberty on the whole. And just think about how this might apply to the employment contract, right? So if the employer is not allowed to fire you for certain reasons, and like one actual protection that employers have to follow is they're not allowed to fire you for becoming pregnant, right? And insofar as that is a regulation, there is less negative liberty for employers to fire at will, right? But we might also realize that that might enhance all three liberties for the employee, right? They might see more options available to them in terms of their reproductive and working choices. They don't have somebody ordering them around, which is more negative liberty. And they might also be less fearful of somebody arbitrarily and unaccountably firing them. So on this picture, Anderson says, we can't just think about liberty as a zero-sum proposition. Instead, we should think about it as a number of competing values that need to be balanced for the various values that they can bring. Now, that sort of leads to the ultimate argument that we're looking for in Anderson, which is that state regulation is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, we can live happier, more prosperous, and more secure lives by having certain constraints on what some actors can and cannot do. And moreover, whereas some will argue that ultimately liberty is an important reason to not have government regulation, Anderson will say, even if you value liberty, this more complex set of three freedoms, positive, negative, and Republican, can show that under certain kinds of regulations placed on the right people in the right ways can make us more free. Now again, Anderson is mindful of the fact that many people think that this doesn't work because the idea of the employment contract is different from state coercion. And in the larger context of her book, Private Government, she does note that free markets can be a tool in advancing people's liberty. So she notes, for instance, that Adam Smith, when he developed the famous invisible hand theory of economic strength through free markets, Smith was advancing that line of thought as a critique of centralized planning within a more feudalistic system. In fact, rather than have a centralized feudal planner telling people what to buy and what to create, it's better off to just have each individual pursue their own private self-interest, which makes everybody better off in the long run. But Anderson notes that after Smith, who wrote in the 18th century, once we get certain 19th century developments in the Industrial Revolution, it's not as if each individual can be the sole proprietor of a business who will make everybody better off by pursuing their own self-interest. With economies of scale, it's much harder for each of us to be producing goods to sell to others. It makes more sense to have larger firms producing those goods and to have employees within those firms. And within those firms, Anderson does note that it's been theorized that a modern firm will use centralized planning. And when we plan in a centralized way, that will decrease the costs of contracting. So we're not like making a deal or holding back goods in every step of the manufacturing process. Information can flow faster and innovation will happen quicker. If you've got different independent contractors all bargaining at each step of the manufacturing of something like a car, this will actually make the process slower, right? And so within a modern firm with a centralized planning, the manager can issue demands, and they actually need to wield open-ended authority. So they can take an employee off one task and put them onto a new task, depending on what the whole firm's needs happen to be. That creates more efficiency. So Anderson will say that this theory of the firm, which says that the modern firm will hire somebody, but then they will have open-ended power to issue orders. She's going to say that it explains and justifies why there is hierarchy of authority, and it will also explain why there needs to be open-ended power and not bargaining about every single task that an employee might perform. But she does say that the theory of the firm doesn't give us a good explanation of the extent of the manager's authority. So the fact that a manager could fire somebody for their behavior on social media or their choice of life partner, well, that would be an overreach that isn't explained through the benefits of centralized planning within the theory of the firm, right? Moreover, the theory of the firm, Anderson points out, sort of says that, well, it's a symmetrical relationship between the employer and the employee, because just like the employer can fire an employee for not meeting up to their end of an employment contract, the employee can also break the employment contract by deciding to quit. And in that way, it's thought of as a reciprocal and mutual relationship. But Anderson suggests that the way in which an employer has open-ended authority to fire an employee is exerting much more control over that employee's life than the employee has over the employer. Yes, they can quit, but the employee's quitting is not a way of firing their boss, and it's not a way of keeping the boss accountable to employee concerns or general ethical considerations that an employee might want to hold their employer accountable for. So in this way, Anderson is going to say just because an employee can exit employment, well, that doesn't justify the extent to which often unjustifiable things are required within the employment contract. One way that she puts it is it would not make sense to say that Mussolini, the Italian fascist, was not a dictator, and arguing that he wasn't a dictator because Italians had the right to emigrate. So just because you can exit a contract doesn't in and of itself make that contract just or not dictatorial. She gives us an analogy on this point. So she points out the fact that prior to certain advances in the 20th century, marriage laws were under what we might call coverture. And the approach of coverture tells us that a woman, upon marrying her husband, lost all property rights and the right to make contracts in her own name. and her husband had the right to confine her movements, confiscate any wages she might earn, beat her, and even rape her. Anderson's point is that this kind of contract, even though it was entered into voluntarily, is still not a legitimate contract. Of course, the requirements within the contract, the rights given up, are just too much. Now she says, imagine within the regime of coverture, imagine if it were easier for women to divorce their husbands, to leave those marriages. And let's say that they even have an opportunity to alter the marriage contract with a prenuptial agreement. Now, this is sort of like the employment situation, right? That people have the right to quit their jobs, and to a certain extent, you could bargain for certain rights before entering into a certain employment contract. Now, do these opportunities to exit and also these opportunities to bargain our contracts, does that justify what we sign up for in the contracts? Well, Anderson says, just as laissez-faire liberals think that any agreed-to employment contract is justifiable, she thinks that we still have a problem within coverture as well, right? Women would certainly have sufficient reason to object that their liberties aren't still being respected, even if they're given the entitlement to attempt prenuptial negotiations, and even if they're given the opportunity to leave the marriage. Because in most societies, the prenuptial agreement will still be made against a patriarchal baseline, in which men still hold virtually all the cards. And her point is that in the employment contract, it's very similar as well. So for instance, no employee working at Amazon is going to enter into that employment contract, but first ensure that the employer will not fire them for certain things that the employer has the legal right to fire them for on the standard contract, whether that be political activity or whether that be certain kinds of speech or whether that might even be things like gender expression, right? They don't get to negotiate like that in the standard situation. And the fact that more opportunity to leave the contract is given, well, that still doesn't make the inherent content of the contract any more justifiable. So just because you voluntarily enter into a contract, and even if it could be renegotiated, that doesn't mean that the contracts themselves still involve, and on a regular basis, unjustified subjection. So Anderson's point here is that we can't simply say that the employment contract is justifiable and non-dictatorial just because employees have nominal rights to negotiate and they have nominal rights to leave their contract. Just as Humer noted, that, well, if you try to leave a country to avoid being in the state, well, you'll find that the only other thing that you can do is become the subject of another state somewhere else. Well, Anderson points out very much the same, right? If you don't like working at the Amazon facility, it seems like your only other option is to work for another employer, whether it be the meat processing plant or some other job, which will require similar things of you. And in that way, we might think that the pro-business baseline is kind of like the pro-men, the patriarchal baseline of coverture. Now, Anderson says, where do we go from here? If the employer has too much power over the employee and that employees aren't given enough say or consideration, she says there are various approaches to promote the interests of governed people. So one thing that we might consider is giving genuine opportunities for exit. And as we've been discussing, libertarians tend to think that rights of exit are a freedom-preserving way of giving redress to people who don't like their contracts or their situations of governance. If you don't like your job, you can leave it. Anderson says, one way that we could promote the right of exit within employment is to note the problem with non-compete clauses. So there are many kinds of jobs where if you leave the job, when you enter into the contract, you promise not to go work for a competitor. Now this might make sense. Say if you're working as an engineer for one car company, you don't want to work on a technology and then quit and then give all the knowledge and advancements that you have to a competitor. But Anderson notes that these sorts of justifications are stretched to their limits. So it's not just for engineers at car companies, but non-compete clauses will also emerge for people who cut hair or people who make sandwiches. And in this way, people are given less opportunity to exit because they have fewer other alternative employers to go to. Anderson also notes and argues that there are some states like California that have banned non-compete clauses, and that California still has a healthy economy, in spite of the fact that non-compete clauses are no longer legal in that state. Another thing that we might do to promote the interests of the governed is to increase rule of law. When we're talking about rule of law, we're talking about consistently stated rules that make it clear when and why an employee might or might not be fired. And that kind of consistency is a way to create accountability and more publicity in that government. And in that way, we might also think about constitutions of workers' rights. So for instance, a corporation could set up something like a workers' bill of rights. And again, we could also think about government regulation coming in here. That a government regulation that ensures protections for certain kinds of political speech or sexual orientation. And that's actually a right which is more entrenched now than when Anderson wrote this book. So we might think that those are the sorts of things that make the interest of those governed more salient, and they have to be respected by the employer. So we might think of those as a way of promoting the interests of those governed. And the last thing we might think of as voice. So one thing that we might notice is that one way of increasing the power and the interests of those governed within the employment contract is union membership. That in certain ways, union membership has promoted the interest of people employed throughout the country. Anderson does note that union membership is not as strong as it once was in America. So the percentages are probably like half at this point of full-time employees, half the number of full-time employees that there used to be. So I think at one point it probably peaked around 50 or 60%. Now about 20% of American workers are working union jobs. Anderson also notes that unions do tend to play this adversarial role with employers, which can be uncomfortable for some employees and can be frustrating for some employers. So that adversarial way that unions interact with employers can be a genuine problem, and it may be a costly way of giving workers voice. Insofar as there are non-adversarial ways of creating workplace government, this is a legally difficult thing in the United States. So forming a union that is literally part of the company is not legal in the US because company unions were banned by the National Labor Relations Act, right? Anderson does note that in other countries things are done differently, and she puts some focus and attention to what is called worker co-determination, which is part of German workplace government. So in German workplace governance, if a company is large enough, then employees are given voting rights on certain central decisions made within the corporation. So if you look at a company like Volkswagen, you find this practice of what we call workplace co-determination, which would be sort of a non-adversarial, collaborative, democratic approach to the workplace. So in this way, this might be something that we could use to move away from a private form of workplace government and more towards a public form of workplace government. So that'll wrap up the discussion, but just to recap some of the main and most important points in Anderson. She says that when you worry about freedom from being governed arbitrarily, we shouldn't just think about the behavior of the state, but we should think about other sorts of government, like the workplace. And she's going to say that the standard justifications of laissez-faire, that is, leave it to its own devices, free market authority within workplace governments, she sees those justifications as inadequate. For one thing, she doesn't think that we can simply defend workplace governance on the idea that people have freely chosen their jobs or that they do have the option of leaving. She says those contracts can still be highly favorable to the employer and to the detriment of the employee. She also points out to us that freedom is not a zero-sum proposition, especially once we consider the three kinds: positive, negative, and Republican liberty. And the last thing that she will acknowledge is that remedies to the problem of private government are complex, and there are limitations and technical questions to be answered when it comes to figuring out how to create more publicity, as she would call it, in government. So we're going to take a turn to a completely different topic in a certain way, but we're going to stay on topic from another perspective by looking at a very different philosopher, Hannah Arendt, in her paper, What is Freedom? Now, the through line that we're going to see in both Anderson and Arendt is that they are critiquing the idea that every time the government shrinks, people become more free. And that's going to be the through line to next time. We're going to see how Arendt thinks about the nature of freedom. It's quite different from how Anderson thinks about it. But she will make a similar argument in that she argues that the creation of certain state entities might be a positive thing for freedom rather than a negative thing for freedom. So that's where we'll go next time. Thanks for listening to this somewhat lengthy discussion, but I think a really interesting and valuable discussion of how we can think about the relationship between freedom, the state, and in a certain way, how to make society more democratic. In any case, thanks and take care.